Afternoon. Welcome to the second program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's 2020 8-week Great Decision Series, with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association of America. I'm Sonia DeYoung. I'm the program manager for Kelvin Academy for Lifelong Learning. And on behalf of President Leroy and the faculty, staff, and students of Kelvin, I thank you for your attendance. Welcome to our academic home, and I hope you return for a visit to our campus soon. Kelvin University is pleased to host the Great Decisions series. In addition, this lecture program fits seamlessly with this series' partner, Kelvin Academy for Lifelong Learning. We are a lifelong learning program providing nearly 120 courses annually to anyone over 50 years of age in the local community. Our purpose is to enrich the lives of our nearly 2,000 members with opportunities for deeper knowledge on a host of subjects. Today, we're honored to welcome Ms. Julie McCarthy, Southeast Asia Correspondent for NPR. After Ms. McCarthy's presentation this afternoon, there will be ample time for questions. We will have microphones ready at each side of the recital hall, and Erica and Michael will be nearby for assistance. You may text to the number we'll show on the screen, or use the response cards if you took one when you came in, and we'll ask your questions for you. Please exhibit civility to our guest and hospitality to others in the audience by asking respectful and succinct questions. And now, Mr. Michael Van Den Ende, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Sonia, and thank you so much to Kelvin University for being our host here in the recital hall and also our live stream host. There are people watching this broadcast all over the state of Michigan and beyond. The Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. World Affairs Council does this in partnership with all of our colleges and universities in West Michigan, and 50 local businesses that also believe that knowing the world is important. We do this to make sure that we empower our mission, which is that to know the world, to first know the world, you have to know the world to change the world. Today we say thank you to Wolverine as series sponsor, to Arconic as our live stream sponsor, to the Community Media Center and the Blue Lake Radio as our media sponsors, and to Grand Valley State University for being our sponsor today. Julie McCarthy is National Public Radio's Southeast Asia correspondent stationed in Manila in the Philippines. Before assuming this post, she served as NPR's international correspondent based in New Delhi, India, where she spent 6 years. She crossed over the border from Pakistan prior to that, where she has established NPR's first permanent bureau in Islamabad. McCarthy won a Peabody Award for her coverage in Pakistan, as well as the Southeast Asia's Journalist Environmental Award for coverage of Pakistan's 500-year flood in 2010. Before moving to Islamabad, McCarthy covered South America as NPR's bureau chief in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, from 2005 to 2009. She covered the Middle East for NPR from 2002 to 2005, where she was first dispatched to report on the Israeli incursion into the West Bank, and later the war in Iraq and the turmoil in Saudi Arabia. Ms. McCarthy has also been NPR's London bureau chief, the lead reporter assigned to investigate Al-Qaeda in Europe after 9/11, the first staff correspondent in Japan, which won her numerous awards, the foreign editor for Europe and Africa, for which she won a second Peabody and other awards. Born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Ms. McCarthy holds degrees in literature and history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she is a lawyer by training. Her presentation today is entitled "The Philippines Under Duterte." Please join me in welcoming NPR's Julie McCarthy.
Thank you so much for coming. I'd also like to thank the World Affairs Council of Michigan for generously inviting me to talk about what's happening under Rodrigo Duterte, President of the Philippines, and its meaning, wider meaning for democracy. And I'm very interested in hearing your ideas and your thoughts in what will be a Q&A. Are we okay with the sound? Let's start with a map of the Philippines. As you can see, the Philippines is made up of 7,000 islands, and it's the largest archipelago nation in the world. Take a look at that. So obviously, boats and airplanes are key to this economy. And here's a wider stretch of this. As you can see, the Philippines stretches down the Pacific Ocean, and we have Taiwan and Japan to the north. Indonesia stretches across the equator to the south, and to the west you have China, and you have the South China Sea, part of which the Philippines calls the West Philippine Sea. Now, that naming rivalry is a metaphor for a bigger struggle underway in the Asian region. And into that struggle steps President Duterte. Before we talk about him and that, a quick look at the country we're talking about, some basic facts. The Philippines is a young country. 52% of the people are under 25 years of age. It's a poor country. The average annual income is $8,400 a year. That ranks it at 148th in the world. There are 105 million people. Most are Roman Catholic. At the helm, you have a profane, pugnacious, and wildly popular president. Rodrigo Duterte is famously unfiltered. He jokes about rape. He's insulted women and gays and the Catholic clergy. The Manila Auxiliary Bishop, Rodrigo Duterte, said to me, "We weren't prepared for him." The disrespect, the vindictiveness, he said. But one of Duterte's favorite targets is the United States. And many of you may have heard the news this past week that Duterte has terminated the visiting forces agreement with the United States. Now, that agreement allows for the easy passage in and out of the country of U.S. forces to conduct such things as joint exercises and training. It smooths the conduct of that relationship. Duterte's decision to pull out of this agreement, it could be a gambit to renegotiate the military relationship with the United States. It could be a poke in the eye of the superpower, which he relishes, often in four-letter terms. Or it could be the first step in breaking this U.S.-Philippine strategic relationship. It's looking more and more like the latter. Whatever it may be, Duterte's given reason for ending this visiting forces agreement goes back to his bloody war on drugs and his refusal to brook any criticism of it. He claims he's terminating this agreement because the United States disrespected the Philippines by canceling the U.S. visa of the former National Police Chief, Ronald De La Rosa, the same police chief who enforced Duterte's war on drugs when he first came to power. That campaign has killed thousands of Filipinos and has been widely condemned, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, by international human rights groups. But you can see what's happening. The future of the Philippine-U.S. security relations are dependent on whether Washington closes ranks with Duterte. If it does, it's business as usual. If the United States challenges him, even indirectly, on his alleged human rights abuses, then he'll tear up a 20-year-old defense agreement with predictable consequences. It shrinks the space in which the United States can operate in Southeast Asia. That is to say, the drug war now bleeds into Philippine military and foreign policy. He's using the blowback from that drug war as a pretext for ending a key defense agreement. Duterte swept to power on a get tough on crime platform. And before he reached Manila, he was the longtime mayor of Davao on Mindanao. And it was there that a UN special representative had found what he called a shocking predictability with which criminals, gang members, and street children were being extrajudicially executed. Now, that report was back in 2008. These next images depict Duterte's scaled-up national anti-drug operations shortly after he became president in 2016. Take a look. That man had gone for burgers in that burger shop right there when he was killed. These were taken in the early years of the drug war. This was in the summer of 2016. It really didn't let up for many, many months. This woman was screaming at the media, "Someone please call 911." This woman is cradling her son, who died in her arms. She told me, he had used drugs, but he wasn't a criminal. And you found throughout this drug war that people who were killed without any charges being filed against them. It was a pure and simple abrogation of due process. Father Albert Alejo is a Catholic priest and a Duterte critic. And he says Duterte skillfully sold these anti-drug operations as a war. Listen to what he says.
Because this is war, there will be collateral damage. Sorry for that. Because this is war, you just have to obey. This discursive ruse is very effective.
Discursive ruse, he calls it. But the scale of the killings has been hotly debated. The Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency says nearly 5,500 people have been killed in these official police operations since June of 2016. Rights groups, however, note that according to police, more than 23,000 people were killed by unidentified gunmen, extrajudicial killings in which Duterte denies any involvement. Yet Duterte doesn't make a speech about the drug war, about the drug problem in the Philippines, without making this warning.
Do not destroy my country.
Do not destroy my country.
Because if you destroy my country, I will kill you.
Because if you destroy my country, I will kill you. He wraps this killing in patriotism. By killing small-time peddlers and addicts, I'm discharging a patriotic duty. Earl Pereño has written a biography of Duterte and his family called Beyond Will and Power. And he told me that Duterte had failed to appreciate the complexity of the drug war, the complexity of solving the drug problem, and he thought he could solve it on his own. Here's what he says.
What he did was, I could solve it on my own. I have my police, I have my army, I have my bureaucracy, which is really a formula for failure in any democracy.
A formula for failure in any democracy. But, and this is an important but, many Filipinos say Duterte made their community safer. And polls show him never more popular than now. The killings seem to be broadly tolerated. Now, all the while that's going on, you have unsolved murders of human rights activists and journalists. And this has helped create in the Philippines a climate of impunity. It is the dark side to what is an extraordinarily beautiful country. So let's look at what the Philippines really looks like. And I don't mean to make you envious here, sitting in Michigan in February, but here is, some of the beauty of this place. Some of the most beautiful beaches. It's a surfer's paradise. It's a hiker's haven. And it is a diver's dream. There are also natural wonders, like Taal volcano that erupted in January. Here it is. Taal volcano. And there are man-made disasters as well. Last year, thank you. Last year, the international watchdog Global Witness declared the Philippines the deadliest country in the world for land and environmental defenders. It says 30 land defenders were killed in the Philippines last year, which outstrips even Brazil. And here are some of these environmentalists at being buried. And of course, these are cases that are never solved, investigated but not solved. And in about a 2-year period, 12 journalists have been murdered in the Philippines. Again, cases that remain unresolved. Duterte is also accused of criminalizing dissent. He weaponizes laws against journalists, and most recently, the country's leading television channel. He's jailed his opponents, including a sitting senator, Leila de Lima. Here she is. She's especially relevant because the U.S. Senate has taken her side. De Lima was an early critic of Duterte's law enforcement tactics as the mayor of Davao. And many believe for that watchdog role, she now sits in jail awaiting trial on charges of drugs that her supporters say are fabricated. Her jailing moved the U.S. Senate to bar anyone responsible for her arrest from entering the United States. When then President Barack Obama vowed to raise human rights during a bilateral meeting in 2016, Duterte scoffed. I'm no American puppet, he said, and he cursed Obama. He later apologized for that, but Duterte has long nursed an animus and animosity against the United States. For the war with the Philippines at the turn of the last century, for the 50 years the Philippines was a U.S. territory. He lashes the U.S. over imperialism. But he did work with the U.S. against terrorism, flushing out Islamist militants in Mindanao. I went to Marawi, this is Marawi, last June for the 2-year anniversary of the siege there. It was a brutal campaign against ISIS-affiliated militants on Mindanao, the southernmost island. Many of the militants were killed. You can see the devastation. The U.S. reportedly assisted with technical advisors. They're still removing the bombs from this area, and they haven't really yet begun any kind of rehabilitation. So while he has worked with the United States on fighting terrorism, Very early on, Duterte had distanced himself from the United States, a traditional ally, in what could ultimately be a turning point in Asia. He executed a dramatic pivot in Philippine foreign policy, turning away from the United States and consciously tilting towards China. Duterte likes Beijing, forgive me, because it can extend aid to him without asking any questions. No questions asked about drug wars or human rights violations. But if the Filipinos tolerate the drug war, there is little support for Duterte's tilt away from the United States and towards China. It makes the Filipinos angry and it makes them nervous. And this brings us back to the South China Sea. Give me 1 second. I don't know how to open this. Maybe I won't have water. This is some contraption. I can't figure out how to open that. We see, so here's the South China Sea, and there are these major island chains in the South China Sea, and lots of, and all in sort of a concentrated area. Thank you very much. But what we also see is China building up a string of artificial islands to fortify its historical claim over nearly the entire South China Sea, including parts of the West Philippine Sea. We see the militarization of these islands. There are airstrips on these islands. Here is one clearly that is a port. This one is loaded with, this is Kelvin Reef. What do we have here? We have communication towers and another airstrip. We've got observation towers and wind turbines. More build-up on an artificial island. Here's Mischief Reef, which I think is always so appropriately named. Mischief Reef, it's got a long airstrip. It's got control towers. It's got it's got very solid infrastructure. This is Subi Reef, and again, you've got a cement mixer. You've got construction material. So you see what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea. And the problem is that many nations share these waters, and countries have competing claims and overlapping claims to these waters. There's Vietnam, there's Indonesia, there's Brunei, there's Taiwan, Malaysia, the Philippines. The waters are rich with fish and purportedly rich with reserves of natural gas and oil. So who controls them matters. A third of the global shipping passes through the sea lanes of the South China Sea. The U.S. conducts freedom of navigation operations to keep those sea lanes open. In Sydney last week, the commander of the Indo-Pacific U.S. forces, Admiral Philip Davidson, said, "The Communist Party of China seeks to control the flow of trade, finance, communications, politics, and way of life of the Indo-Pacific." China has ratcheted up tensions by claiming nearly the entirety of the South China Sea. 2 years before Duterte came to power, the Philippines challenged the Chinese claim. They went to a UN tribunal at The Hague, and The Hague sided with the Philippines. It declared that China never had a historical vast claim over the South China Sea. That had no legal merit. And one of the things that was brought into court was this map that the Philippine side had acquired at an auction for an awful lot of money. And a private businessman had purchased it and lent it to the Philippine side to make their case. And what it shows is the Scarborough features down here. Scarborough features are actually part of the Philippines. And this is dated 1734. So they use this, they argue this, and it helps them make the case. The UN sides with them. But China has ignored this UN ruling and is threatening other nations in the South China Sea who have legitimate claims to its waters. China increasingly pushes around the Philippines by intimidating its fishermen, who are poor and defenseless. Last summer, a Chinese fishing trawler rammed and sank a Filipino fishing boat near Reed Bank in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. And maritime experts say China is really militarizing its fleet to act as a sort of merchant marine patrolling the sea. Here is the boat that was rammed and sunk, the Gemver, and here's the captain with that boat, and here's the hole in that boat that was made when they were rammed by the Chinese. And here's the fishing village, which is a 3-day sail from where they were sunk. And this is an impressive shot. This is the flotilla, it's called, of Chinese fishing vessels heading out to the South China Sea. The Filipino crew told me a harrowing story of what happened to them that night. It was about midnight when they were rammed, and they called out to the ship that had rammed them for help. And the ship turned on all these lights, trained it on the sinking ship, and killed the light suddenly, threw this steel-hulled boat in reverse, moved back, and left these Philippine fishermen floundering in the night sea. Bobbing off in the distance was a Vietnamese shipping boat, and 2 crewmen from this sinking ship rowed to 2 hours to the Vietnamese ship and did a pantomime to tell them that what was happening, that their ship was sinking, taking on water, and the Vietnamese ship steamed to their rescue. Now, this whole ordeal enraged the Philippine people, but Duterte had a different interpretation, a different response. Rather than defend his own fishermen, he offered what sounded like a defense of China. After all, he said, no one died. An arbitration ought to determine what happened before we sign any blame, he said. The Chinese ultimately admitted what had happened. And to the dismay of many Philippine watchers, Duterte turned around and began talking about sharing Philippine waters with China and jointly exploring for oil and gas with them, arrangements that many fear will favor China. Now, there's a whole other interpretation of this that says, wait, maybe this is the way to go. Maybe arrangements that tie up jointly with China to explore the riches of the sea are a way to buy peace. But this whole fishing fiasco sort of brought Duterte's tilt towards China into sharp relief. And the terminating of the Visiting Forces Agreement has underscored that. A former Philippine Supreme Court Justice, Antonio Carpio, said, both defense and foreign affairs officials have told Duterte that scrapping this Visiting Forces Agreement will remove a potent deterrence against Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea. And Carpio believes that Duterte won't stop at the Visiting Forces Agreement, that he will go for what he calls the jugular, terminating the Mutual Defense Treaty that's been in effect since 1951. And that agreement requires the Philippines and the U.S. to defend each other in the event either party is attacked by another country. Ending that agreement, Carpio says, would fulfill what Duterte declared to his Chinese hosts in October of 2016. He told them, I've realigned myself in your ideological flow, and maybe I'll go to Russia to talk to Putin and tell him that there are 3 of us against the world, China, Philippines, and Russia. It's the only way, he said. Now, to fill the gap that would be left by the end of the U.S. visiting forces, the Philippine Armed Forces Chief, General Filemon Santos, suggested a possible military tie-up with China. And this tilt towards China is now playing out against a backdrop of epical of an epochal shift that's already underway. The great powers, the United States and China, are locked in a ferocious competition now about who will influence this region diplomatically, economically, and militarily. And it is about who will ultimately control the balance of power in the Asian Pacific. By shredding defense agreements with the United States, Duterte is narrowing the space in which the United States can operate in that region of the world, and thus expanding the space China can occupy. And Duterte sits smack in the middle of these great powers. Now, you could call him a realist. China is rising, he says. It's a fact of geography. They're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere. And he's looking to align himself with the regional power and a potential superpower, one that doesn't ask embarrassing questions. And besides, Duterte says the Philippines doesn't have the capacity to challenge China. So perhaps this is his "if you can't beat them, join them" moment. But if Duterte is willing to cede to Beijing waters which the Philippines rightly claims, that has far-reaching implications. It sets a precedent that could embolden China to keep intimidating its neighbors and their fishing fleets in order to dominate the region. China has already done that with the Philippines. It's certainly done it also with Vietnam. There's a standoff between the Chinese and the Vietnamese Coast Guards. The Chinese have also tried to intimidate the Indonesians. But you can see in these images that these countries are pushing back. They're trying to repel China. They're trying to draw bright lines with China. Duterte is doing the opposite. He's inviting China in and daring the United States to come and challenge China in the South China Sea. But the polls show something quite different when you ask the Filipino people. They say they prefer the United States over China by wide margins. They say they don't trust the Chinese. But the biographer, Earl Pereño, says Duterte admires Xi Jinping. He admires Vladimir Putin. He'd like to govern the way they do, he says. But if you're emulating Xi and you're emulating Putin, you're not a steward of democracy. You're verging on the authoritarian. And Duterte, in that respect, is no one-off in this world. He's part of a trend we see in democracies, democratic countries around the globe. We see it in India, the world's biggest democracy. Modi has unleashed anti-Muslim passions and defends it in the name of Hindu religion. We see populism on offer in Brazil, South America's biggest democracy. Leaders are using populism to gain traction. In other words, appealing to ordinary citizens who feel their concerns are disregarded by the governing elite. And these populists then flout the rule of law, find scapegoats, and harass their critics. In the United States, we're debating the limits of power. How far can we go with the limits of power? We heard that in the impeachment proceedings. But in the Philippines, democracy is facing a real test. And increasingly, Duterte ignores checks and balances. He intimidates opponents. Even the vice president, Leni Robredo, a Duterte critic, to be sure, she's not immune from this sort of harassment. She has just recently been cleared last week of sedition charges, of involvement in sedition over this murky scheme to destabilize the government. But the priest you heard from earlier still faces charges that he conspired to commit sedition. So it can be dangerous to be a critic of Duterte. He has silenced a lot of people in that young democracy, a democracy that he increasingly wants to push towards China. And I can't let you go, listen to all that ferment, without giving a thought to this tranquil note, to end on a tranquil note. This is Leyte Bay shot taken in October at the 75th anniversary of General MacArthur's landing that expelled the Japanese from the Philippines and turned the tide of World War II. Thank you very much. and we can open it up to questions if people have questions. Okay.
Coming from our remote sites, and of course we'll have questions from the live audience as well. Just as a reminder, if you do want to text in questions, you can do that by going to 616-308-6560. I'm going to give you two questions that are kind of two sides of the same coin, perhaps. First is, how does the U.S.'s colonial history with the Philippines figure into President Duterte's pivot towards China? And then the other question is that looking back on those slides of the drug wars, you saw a sign that said drug user and then in parentheses Chinese. So is there ethnic tension between Filipinos and the Chinese in the Philippines that is maybe part of this pushback as well?
Okay, good questions. First question, how does the colonial history of the United States figure into Duterte's pivot? I think it figures in, it does figure in. It figures in his framework of understanding the relationship between the United States and the Philippines. And, you know, there are many people in the Philippines who would regard the Americans as friends, but also look at a period of their history that was brutal. There was a brutal war that the United States fought against the Philippines at the turn of the last century, which resulted in the Philippines becoming a territory for 50 years. That whole history still is talked about. I can't say remembered as much. Some people who are older would remember it. But the older generation tend to have very warm feelings about the United States by virtue of World War II. That ended the territory relationship between the Philippines and the United States. It won its freedom at the close of World War II. And it was liberated by the United States from Japanese imperial troops. So there tends to be in an older generation a very warm feeling toward the United States. The younger generation does tend to graft on, as many young generations do across the world, to their colonial past. They want to understand it. It's something that they feel they need to rebel against. And certainly Duterte it would be one of those. You know, there was an interesting event that happened when he was mayor that many people ascribe to his turn against the United States. There was an American who was operating in Mindanao. What exactly this American was doing is murky and it's unclear. But one fine day, he was extracted by the United States in a black ops operation. And it took place in Davao when Duterte was mayor. And he took that as a personal affront, that the Americans would come in and snatch one of their citizens out of the Philippines without so much as any kind of notice given to him. And he viewed that as the kind of imperial arrogance of the sort that he decries and ascribes to the United States still. So yes, I think the colonial past sort of rests in his mind, and interestingly enough, it also rests in the minds of a younger generation. In fact, a very popular performance was staged recently in Manila by young and attended by many, many students, and it's the story of the Spanish occupation, as it were, the Spanish colonialization, and it's extremely well attended. They want to know about their colonial past. They want to understand it, and they want to somehow carve an identity out of it that is anti-imperial, that is anti-colonial. So it means a lot to a young generation. As far as, let's see if I can read my writing here. Oh yes, the tag that was thrown up on the drug victim. There is a great deal of tension between the Philippines and the Chinese. It's always been an undercurrent, small undercurrent, but you have to understand these two countries, these two people have traded with each other for thousands of years. They know of each other. So in that regard, there is a familiarity there. But as Duterte pushes China on the Philippine people, they are resisting, and they're resisting in the form, oftentimes, of xenophobia, which is what you saw sprawled across that man's chest. There's a fear in the Philippines that the Chinese are there taking their jobs. There's hundreds of thousands of Chinese who are now working in the Philippines, and that is as a result of Duterte's opening to them. There's a lot of private investment in the Philippines by Chinese money. There's a lot of real estate being bought up by the Chinese. So there is a sense, and people say this word, of being invaded by the Chinese. So yes, there is very, very strong sense, and it's not diminishing, it's actually growing.
So if you are in the audience, please raise your hand, otherwise I'm going to go. We've got two here, and then come back to me.
Do you see evidence of this populist authoritarianism in other Asian countries?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, you do not see it in Indonesia, which is the vast fourth most populous country in the world. You see a kind of a technocrat is at the helm there. What they're battling with down in Indonesia is the rise of conservative Islamist elements in Indonesia. And even conservative Islam is much more evident than it was 20 years ago. More women are wearing hijabs, more women are covering up. There's an asserted effort to be religious in Indonesia. So that's what they're having to contend with. And Joko Widodo, their president, is a technocrat. And he is really trying to keep a lid on all of this, this ferment that rises with Islamist fundamentalism. Other autocrats, well, you could arguably have an autocrat in Cambodia, and the Cambodians are very close to the Chinese. They get a tremendous amount of aid from the Chinese. The Vietnamese, a communist-ruled country, doing very well, thank you, and getting closer and closer to the United States. And their relations with China are, of course, historic and therefore complicated. They share a long border with the Chinese mainland, and it's a complicated relationship because they too see themselves at some level in serious conflict with the Chinese over who is going to control their part of these resource-rich South China Sea. Just recently, there was a standoff in the South China Sea where the Chinese had surrounded a Vietnamese vessel. And the purpose, anybody could discern, was simply to intimidate and lay claim to that territory. And the Vietnamese weren't budging. So they have a very they're in tune in the sense that they're, the last two communist countries really in the region, Laos, so they have their own sets of problems that they're looking at. But autocracy, it's a communist state. Japan, democratic society. Korea, same thing. Taiwan is a very interesting case because of what, the potential there for what could be a global flashpoint over the future of Taiwan. China and Xi Jinping have made no doubts about what she calls the great reclamation, the great reflowering, the great reincarnation of the Chinese state. And that really is code for Hong Kong, you are part of us, don't think anything otherwise. Macau, you're part of us, don't get any ideas. And Taiwan, you've had funny ideas for a very long time, but all you are is a renegade province. And we mean to, if we must by force, join you to greater Mother China. So Taiwan is in a very, very delicate moment because they have at their helm a president who is dead set against joining as a state the Chinese nation. Taiwan is its own thing, it's its own state, and the United States, who is, a longtime friend of Taiwan, but honors, China's as diplomatic relations, will be tested when the Chinese, if they do make good on their threat to use force over the Straits of Taiwan. What will the United States do? The Taiwanese have serious self-defense, but whether or not they have self-defense enough to repel any Chinese quote-unquote invasion is another question altogether. And I'll tell you what the Taiwanese worry about. They say what we worry most about is the idea that they hate us so much. They've been taught to hate us so much that when the day comes when they do arrive, it will be an awful day. I mean, people really have deep fears, I guess you could call it, trepidation about that day arriving. But, Duterte seems to be on a track and on a pace toward autocracy that is really not seen anywhere else in Asia. In that sense, he is kind of the odd man out, sort of really pushing toward emulating China, emulating Putin.
Two questions.
Where are you?
First, from a populist perspective, you need economic growth to begin to provide the poor with that which the elites were not providing before. Is that happening in the Philippines? How much will the loss of U.S. base rights and otherwise cost the Philippine economy? So how are they doing economically? And then I've forgotten the second one, so that's just okay. One.
It'll come to you. Great question. The Philippine economy is growing about 6% a year. But the Philippine economy also is, it's subject to the vagaries of the Asian region. And the Asian region now is being rocked by the coronavirus. Chinese manufacturing in Hubei province has stopped. The iPhone manufacturing is really taking a hit. And there are a lot of economic ties throughout the region and the Philippines. So it is bound to redound to its detriment. One of the big things that the Philippines has begun to rely on is tourism. South Korea leads the pack for tourists, followed by the Chinese, followed by the Japanese, followed by the Americans. So the Chinese are a big ingredient in that tourism economy, which they've been really trying to build. And they come. The Chinese you find them all over the Philippines vacationing. And to the degree that is disrupted, that is a huge knock on the Philippine economy. We don't yet know where the dust is going to settle with the coronavirus in terms of the economic potential downturns it creates. But they're not small. The auto parts industry in the Philippines is bracing for what's to come. They have a lot of exports to China for auto parts. So it's an uncertain picture right now, but the economy is growing. It has been growing, and big projects like dams are reliant on Chinese money, Japanese money. Japanese money, we don't know what's going to happen with the Japanese money. The Chinese money just is kind of coming in trickles. They were promised the sky, and the flow is just not coming as they thought it would, and they're finally admitting that. The loss to the Philippine economy as a result of sort of terminating these agreements with the United States, yet to be calculated. But the Philippines, the United States is the second, biggest trading partner, third biggest trading partner. The United States is the third biggest trading partner, second biggest trading partner with the Philippines. The problem with all of this, from a Philippine perspective, is that they enjoy privileges. They enjoy a privileged trade status by virtue of being a longtime traditional ally in Asia. And if you're in the game of unspooling all of that, how long do you think it will take a Trump administration to remove your privileges? And things just start to become more expensive, and all of these trade advantages start to evaporate. So these things, they have real concrete effects. We haven't seen them yet. It's early the hour is early, but they will come if he does indeed mean to unspool this relationship.
Questions from the audience, but first, here's some text from our remote sites. 3 questions. Why is President Duterte so popular?
Okay.
And will his popularity erode since it seems as if the Filipino people do not care for this alliance with China? Will there be pushback? And then finally, what is the role of the Catholic Church? Could you maybe give a bit more context about what they're doing in the Philippines to push back against President Duterte?
The Catholic Church has been described to me as the biggest NGO in the Philippines. And in many regards it is. It runs homeless shelters, and it provides food, and it provides education. When it comes to getting into the political game with Duterte, it tends to stand back. There are some of the harshest critics, however, are also priests and some archbishops, but they aren't great in numbers because it's a very high price to pay. And I talk to the church about this, and they say, no, we think the drug war is not good, and we've said so. But they don't rally people to the kind of a moral imperative against the killing. They've not done that. So the church has sort of stood on the sidelines for this, for the tumult, really, that's going on in the country. It's not to say they lack power. They don't use the power that way. And it may be that the Vatican doesn't want them using the power that way. That's a very political game, and they may feel they're not at a Marcos moment where the church did finally become very engaged in unseating Mr. Marcos. How will the Chinese drive affect his popularity? It's a very curious thing. The Filipinos hold almost simultaneously in their head two different ideas about Mr. Duterte. It's the guy who's going to come and give us quick justice. We like that. The guy who's offending the church, maybe that's out of order, people will say to you. But, the church is guilty of a massive sex abuse scandal. So they hold this even a kind of a dual idea in their mind about the church. And so if you're going to insult the church, maybe that's not so bad either. Insulting women, people seem to kind of laugh that off, except a lot of women. And the Chinese, in terms of the Chinese and how that figures into things, like they tend to see their country not in international geopolitical terms, which in some ways is what this whole tie-up with China is all about. What they are bothered about is when they see Chinese that they think are taking their jobs or buying up Manila. That bothers them greatly. But so far, they have given Duterte a pass on this. Now, once he starts unspooling what has been a very popular relationship with the Philippine people, which is the U.S.-Philippine partnership, then we'll see whether or not that really tests and whether that will erode his popularity. But so far, this grafting to China hasn't really had a huge effect on him, on his popularity. His popularity is in the high 70s. I mean, this is extraordinary for someone who's halfway through his tenure. Your third question. Oh, the pushback from the church. Oh, why is he so popular? Did I cover that? No, I didn't. A little bit. Why is he so popular? He's popular, this is the fascinating question. He's popular, first of all, you have a very young democracy. People were very excited about people power. They were very excited about democracy taking roots in the Philippines after Marcos. But democracy's hard, and it's messy, and it's particularly hard and messy in a country like the Philippines that has so many problems. Its capacity in so many areas is low. The education is really taxed in the Philippines, meaning to say, it's on a level that is very difficult to build an economy with, to build, say, an IT economy with. It's not there yet, and they're falling further behind in Asia. So you have that problem there. You have the vast disparity between rich and poor. That's not gone away there. So along comes Duterte, and then you have people's, there's a violence in the Philippines that is deeply troubling. And you have a guy who comes along and says, listen, I know how to take care of that violence. It's rather simple, and I'm going to start. And it's quick, and it's pretty easy. This guy delivers quick justice. It's not justice that anybody considers to be due process justice, but he's seen as taking care of a problem, and he's seen as making them safer. He's seen as going against oligarchs. 50 families control a massive amount of wealth in the Philippines. They control the levers of the economy, and in many ways, they control the levers of power. He rails against them. He's also in bed with them. He's in bed with the Marcoses. But he's now beginning to turn on them. In fact, 2 weeks ago, he was talking about, well, maybe we just ought to kill the rich. I mean, this is a whole new concept. I mean, it's one thing to talk about killing, this comes on the heels of, killing the archbishops, and now we're going to kill the rich. But in a country that is just so strained by, economics and poverty, this doesn't sound, outrageous. And they take him to be outrageous, but they take his point. Too few people have too much. They believe that, and that's really what he's giving expression to. So when you ask why he's popular, he's a guy who delivers fast justice, if you want to call it justice. He is, as I say, it's messy in a different kind of way. He's really made democracy messy in a different kind of way. But that the hard slog of building a nation takes time. And the democracy in the Philippines is only, 30 years old. But people are impatient because now they're all connected to the world and they want what everyone else has. And if it can't be delivered, let's find the guy who's got some ready answers for us. That's how I can explain his popularity.
We've run out of time, but I want to get this woman in the middle. So if you need to leave, please do, but let's get this question.
Sure. Great.
Given the violence in the Philippines right now, how safe are you and your colleagues in the Manila Bureau? And also, I wanted to ask if your own and others are experiencing any restrictions on your reporting.
Thankfully, I have not. I'm not greeted with open arms at Malacanang Palace either, but I don't feel that. That's not to say they won't come. It's just, they haven't gotten around to us yet, or, they don't pay attention to what we're saying. How safe are we? That is such an interesting question. You're always on guard. You have to always be on guard. I live, and I never thought I'd say this, I live in a high rise. I'm a house person, right? I live in this high rise. I live on the 18th floor, which also scares me to death. And it's in a secure building, or at least I think it's secure, In fact, the landlord was joking to me, why do you want those doors and locks fixed? Why would you ever use the locks? And I'm thinking, I'm going to use the locks. So you're up on the 18th floor, you're kind of, you're off the ground, you have this illusion you're in a secure area. So, when you're home, you feel, yeah, I'm safe, and I'm safe here. You go out on the streets. I live in an area that in some ways looks like Chicago, but I work in areas that look like the slums of Chicago. And in those areas, you are, I have to say, I don't know that I'm any more on my guard in those neighborhoods, because people tend to be exceedingly friendly in the Philippines, than in my own neighborhood. But violence is real, and I'm going to quickly just wind up with this. There's no question violence is real, and it is directed at people who are Duterte critics. I was talking to one of these priests who has been outspoken against Duterte, and he was one of the priests who had received death threats. And I was talking to him about that. I said, what form do they call you? What form do they take? He said, oh, no, they come to the homeless, my homeless shelter. They come to the church. They come to where I am, but the guards repel them because they don't know them. And I said, well, when does this happen? When was the last time it happened? He said, oh, it happens a few times a week, every week. And I said, well, who are these people? He said, we don't know who they are. We don't know who they are. And he sort of was describing kind of granular detail, what these guys were and how the guards described them to him and what they asked for. The interview's over and I leave his homeless shelter and I walk outside and I turn to my left and there I see a man. It's about 95 degrees out. There's a man standing there in a mask with a hat on, with his motorcycle parked across the street, staring up at Father Flavi's office. And then he walked across the street, and he did the same thing. Then he walked back and forth in front of what is a shop. There's a Christian shop that's on the ground floor of this massive shelter. And he's kind of shaking the doors. He's trying to get in there, and he can't get in there. And after a while, I mean, he clearly cased the place, walked across the street, tried to case it from across the street. He knew he couldn't get into the entrance. Got on his motorcycle and drove away. So, and I'm watching this thinking, it's real. I mean, these threats are real. I mean, why is somebody standing there masked and, 95 degree? It just didn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And oftentimes, assailants will come up on motorcycles and they're wearing masks, and mayors get shot and vice mayors get shot, and it's an extremely violent place. Just last week, there was a mayor of a major city was gunned down in the lobby of a major Manila hotel. It is a violent place, but there's usually a target. Yeah, there's usually a target for it. So do you feel safe? Are you afraid of Duterte? Are you afraid of the reach of his government? I mean, you have to be on guard for all of that stuff. And the problem with many of these countries, like Pakistan, for example, everything's fine until it's no longer fine. And you don't know when that moment's coming. So you tend to be as on guard as you possibly can, as much as you can. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for coming.